Thank you all who have stayed throughout the entire day. We've had a number of really interesting and engaging discussions, and I promise you this panel will not disappoint. My name's Shireen Zaman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. I just want to echo the thanks of my colleague moderators from earlier panels and express thanks to the co-organizers for this event. I'll briefly introduce our panelists, and similar to the format from previous panels, we're just going to go ahead and engage in a conversation and bring all of you into that conversation as well. So I'm happy to introduce Kathleen Foley, who's a fellow at ISPU and just received her PhD from Cornell's Department of City and Regional Planning, where she studied land use planning and conflict management in public processes. Mohamed Elibiary is a Texas-based Muslim community leader and advisor to multiple segments of the Homeland Security enterprise. And Remziya Suleyman is Director of Policy and Administration for the American Center for Outreach in Tennessee. So we have the special privilege of having a panel full of people who are not based in Washington, which, as we know, in D.C. is very rare, and people who are really working on various components of issues related to mosques in America. I want to start by just framing the discussion a little bit. Mostly what we're going to focus on in this panel are some of the contemporary kind of issues related to mosque and mosque construction. And just to give a bit of a general overview, the study was referenced on a panel earlier today, and the study was done by CARE and ISNA and a number of our colleague organizations, the 2011 study of mosques in America. So just to give you a few numbers, that study indicated that there's about 2,106 mosques in America, and that this represents a 74% increase over the number of mosques in 2001. So I think that that's important to note, because despite these cases of mosque opposition and definitely sort of organized opposition to some of these initiatives, there still is a pretty healthy increase in terms of mosque construction in the last 10 years. But it's also important to note, according to some of the Gallup Pew research, that there's about 20 to 35% of the Muslim community that actually regularly does not attend mosques. So when we're talking about mosques in America, we also have to recognize that it's not that the entire community that identifies as Muslim in America actually actively is engaged in their local mosque. So with that, I want to start and turn kind of for an opening general question to our panelists, who, as you can tell by their bios, really approach the issue of mosques in America from very different perspectives, and just ask each of you to talk a little bit about your experience, whether in your local community, nationally, or through your research, on sort of the question of mosques in America and really some of the dispelling some of the mysteries that the general American public has about what happens at the mosque. So Kathleen, why don't we start with you?
So I'm sorry.
Just a general sort of how have you in your research approached the issues related to mosques in America?
So my research, I've done case studies. Most mosque development that's happened in the last decade has seen the largest amount of growth in mosque development, and that has to do primarily with the growth of the immigrant population, Muslim immigrant population in the U.S. as part of an overall growth of immigrant population in the U.S. since 1990, and the establishment of financial footing on the part of Muslim American faith communities in the last 2 decades, and the readiness and ability to establish mosques in this country. And because of the demographics and changing settlement patterns of immigrants in this country, most of that new development is happening in suburban districts. So my work has been to look at particular mosque developments in suburban districts and look at the ways that both the faith community and neighborhood neighbors and the municipalities have handled conflict, worked through conflict to get to approval and develop mosques in these neighborhoods. And I looked particularly at mosques that were developed in the 18 months following September 11th, so that they were subject to the same media frenzy that was following 9/11. What we're seeing now, I just want to emphasize that what we saw in the wake of Park 51, although it's shocking on some levels and surprising, it's not new. Kathleen Moore, I think she's still here, has documented mosque controversy over a 30-year period, beginning in the early 80s. Land use and change and the development of religious institutions is always controversial. Mm-hmm. Baptist congregations of all stripes and varieties face opposition in their land use proposals. What is different now about mosque development is not only 9/11, but it is the organization of the opposition. We've talked before about the report Fear Inc. There is a nationally organized, well-funded network that is driving opposition at the local level to mosque development. I think Remziya can speak to that very clearly.
Yeah, I mean, for us in Tennessee, and I'm going to speak from a local level because that's where I know best, and my work is really centered around what's happening in Tennessee. I first started a lot of my work around the immigrant refugee issues, and later on in our state, very recently, over the past 2 years, we saw a shift from anti-immigrant really to anti-Muslim rhetoric in our state. It was really interesting to see a movement now from really defending immigrant and refugee rights to a movement to protecting religious freedom and the construction of mosques in our state. And so my work has been with and definitely supporting the establishments of mosques and other religious institutions. But the one thing that I focused on is really just kind of explaining what Islam is, what Muslims are, what it means to be Muslim in America, and most importantly, like I said earlier, preserving religious freedom. Most notoriously in our state, I think many people have heard about the Murfreesboro Mosque incidents, where there are a series of attempts to block fairly, at the time, a small mosque who wanted to expand since the congregation was growing. And we've seen a series of attempts really legally, but the other attempts you've seen is really people in the streets and kind of protesting the community. I have to say that the individuals in the opposition, I don't want to give them too much credit, but I want to give them credit for being loud and well-funded. I have to say that you know, the group, when it first started, it was a loose network, and now with the support of national groups who are coming into our state, and they're bringing folks like dirt welders over from Holland to talk to our lawmakers, and lawmakers kind of supporting these individuals, they have become much more organized, and the national funding that's pouring into them makes them much more louder than they actually are in Tennessee, specifically since the opposition in Tennessee is also being met with another opposition, which is much more interfaith-led, and I'll talk about that later on.
Great. Mohamed?
So my experience is that I grew up in Dallas, in the Dallas Central Mosque, in Richardson, and basically after 9/11 there was major prosecutions and stuff, so the government hammer came down, and I saw my community really get scared, and before that the larger society around us never really cared. So it was Texans are, by their very nature, they tend to be a little bit more libertarian than most of the Deep South, so they hadn't really bothered with the Muslim community. Most of the neighbors and the churches and what have you had a very positive relationship with the community. But all of a sudden there was this security cloud that just came over the community. And if you're familiar with a lot of those cases, that's what is now kind of seen in the national media as the whole U.S. Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas funding and conspiracy stuff that flies around in the blogosphere. So all that kind of just kind of blew up in our face. So I basically decided to go back into the community, because prior to that I was in obviously my 20s at the time, so I was just working. And I noticed that there was, we were fortunate that we had organizations in our community like CARE that were doing the civil rights work already. So it opened up for me an opportunity to advocate in the interfaith communities. So up to that point, our community had done interfaith on a retail level at the mosques, where you would have like the open houses, people can come and ask, give me the Islam 101 talk. But interfaith community relations, of sitting down with other faith communities to say what are your public policy positions and where can we find our common ground and build a coalition in the state legislature so that you'd build your friends before you need them. As a Jewish legislator in Houston taught us, we hadn't done that. So we teamed up. The Jewish community was very helpful to us at that time, and we were able to essentially help bring the Muslim community through the biggest mosques around the state into a loose coalition in a foundation I ran at the time in order to go down to the legislature and basically take the what I call the social policy fears in society of these mosques, of what is their long-term agendas, and basically help with the new immigrant integration. So basically the first thing we would do is we organized a Muslim legislative day, and we passed the Muslim halal bill version, and you have the first imam doing the prayer in the Texas House of Legislatures. So the Muslim community in all these steps felt like they were getting a seat at the table, but at each one of these steps you have the Jewish community helping by sponsoring the legislative statute for the halal bill based on the 2 decades old kosher statute that had been passed in the state of Texas. The Texas Baptist Convention in the Christian Life Commission was very helpful, and they would also speak at the Muslim Legislative Day event. The mainline Protestant judicatory bodies would also. So the Muslim community began to see the mosque leaders that, okay, there's this interfaith community relations level of engagement, and we don't really have our own agenda other than just we don't want to get picked on. So as long as other faith communities basically will agree to that the constitutional rights are for all, including us, then we can get behind the Children's Health Insurance Program legislation. So that was like one of the first joint statement that a lot of mosques around the state joined. By the end of this process of going into each one of these mosques and doing, I had a little 3-step program that I would lead. I'd go in, I'd meet with the board, I'd basically tell them, look, this is where I come from, a couple of counties over. My family's been in the community for decades. My father is the president of the largest mosque in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So it's like I'm rooted here. And basically what we want is we want to follow the Texas Baptist model, which is we're not speaking for Muslims, but we're speaking to Muslims, which is kind of it flipped the script to what our community was used to. And the second step is after speaking to their board, so I basically took care of the inner community politics right away by making them feel comfortable that I wasn't trying to kind of build something over them. And then the second step is that I would give a sermon in the mosque. So every Friday, and you know the usual will bring most mosques outside speakers. So I get on the circuit, I gave the sermon, so basically get the religious bona fides. So you get the conservative element in that congregation feeling like, okay, you're religiously grounded, you're not a cultural Muslim only. You can kind of at least talk the talk, and you understand, like what was covered earlier, the difference between Sharia, fiqh, hudud. So usul al-fiqh, how basically jurists in Islamic law arrive at decisions. So they feel like as a leader in this effort, my decisions are not just pragmatic, short-term interested, but they're really grounded in Islamic principles. And then the third thing that we would do is we would hold a forum in that mosque. And finally, we'd get the board to sign a membership form in our network. By the end of this process, and the mosques that came on board from most of the cities across the state allowed us to sit with, like I said, all these other faith communities and say, we're not speaking on behalf of 100,000 Texas Muslims, but that's how many people are connected with these congregations on a weekly basis across the state. And basically, by y'all engaging with us and helping to lead this largely new immigrant community, finding its seat at the table and supporting it, they're going to follow the same road and path that other faith communities have followed. And then at these legislative day events, I would also in 2004, I basically gave a presentation to the community leaders about the history of Texas Muslim immigration. So we all know about Muslims coming as slaves, but in 1854 is when the first group of seven Muslims immigrated to Texas, specifically, not to the whole United States. They essentially came on a military guest worker program. Basically, the 1848 war got the Southwest Desert from Mexico, and the Army was like, so how do we explore this area and find wells and settlement? And they were like, well, there's deserts in the Middle East. Why don't we just import people from there? So they brought their camels. And the first guy, the leader of the group, his name was Haji Ali. And you can Google these stories. But his name was so difficult that they ended up calling him Hi Jolly because he laughed a lot. So there's a monument in Arizona honoring him for the work they did. But there's nothing in Texas. So the Texas Muslim community didn't even know its history. And then the second and final part of the mosque part was security related. So I had to team up with find Muslims that actually understood the security world. So I found Muslims that had top secret clearance, former military intelligence officers. They understood the security world behind the curtain instead of what most of us as civilians kind of interacted post 9/11 with it. So they started briefing me, educating me. I started learning from others inside of these different agencies. I basically figured out how to reconcile the perception of concerns and suspicions on the one side from security and intel agencies and the Muslim community and its concerns for security of the congregations and that kind of thing. Once you reconcile those two worlds, then each one knows their division of labor, where theirs begin and the others picks up. The whole radicalization, intervention, concern about violent extremism stuff can get worked out with proper information sharing protocols and that kind of thing. And that's the route that we worked basically from about 2002 to 2007. And unfortunately, for the past 5 years, I haven't gotten to do a lot more of the interfaith work because I've been sucked up here in D.C. in the security side.
Well, that's helpful. There's a couple of pieces that each of you talked about that I want to come back to, but I guess I want to first start with a little bit more kind of back to the basics in terms of what is a mosque? Do mosques have congregations and memberships? How does the structure of the American mosque work in terms of the broader faith community? So Kathleen, I know you just wrote actually a report jointly through ISPU and the British Council kind of documenting sort of almost the form and function and people of the mosque. So maybe you can give us a little bit of that high-level overview, and Mohamed and Remziya can talk about that more also at their kind of community-based level.
So definitions.
And kind of general functioning. How does the mosque work, and what does it look like inside, and those types of things. I mean, just to kind of get our audience all at the same page.
Well, I think it's important. You know, we've used the word congregation a lot, and I found that I grew up Roman Catholic, and so the word congregation, parish, was very much part of my experience. And I found that when I was working in the field with Muslim faith communities, a number of people would say to me, well, no, we're not members, and this isn't a congregation. I had to be re-educated about how Muslims see themselves, and not re-educated, completely educated about how Muslims see themselves and their place in the Ummah, in the worldwide community of Muslims. And I think this is something that's essential for Muslims and scholars to communicate to the broader public, that there is this sense of universality in Islam, and that traditionally Muslims don't necessarily feel that they belong to a particular mosque, but they go to a mosque for convenience at prayer times. In this country, where mosques are few and far between, it can be difficult for Muslims to travel to make prayers, either daily prayers or Friday prayers, the congregational prayer, because of distances from work. And so Prayers often are made in the workplace and school, as we did today, folks excusing themselves to other rooms to make prayers. So there is, I think, a greater sense of belonging to a particular mosque because folks affiliate in local areas with particular communities, but they still may not think of themselves as members of a congregation in the way that Baptists or other faith communities might. There is a greater sense of affiliation, but still perhaps not the sense of that same equivalency. However, when communicating in interfaith settings, etc., I think that it is easier to recognize that although the terms may not directly translate, it is useful to talk about congregation and membership, and to recognize that sense of belonging does grow as individuals are part of building a faith community, getting a building built. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can give a different perspective.
Yeah. I mean, in Tennessee, for us, going back to our community and our state being a new destination state for immigrants and refugees, I mean, we saw an influx of immigrants within the past 25 years into Tennessee. Not saying there weren't immigrants there, but they were, but not at high levels that we saw come in, particularly in the 90s. As we saw the influx of the Kurdish refugees, we saw the influx of Somali refugees, Sudanese, thereon and so forth. So in Tennessee, it's somewhat of a different creature, I like to say. The mosques were established to serve the communities that were there. So for example, in the Middle Tennessee region, we have about 10 to 12 mosques, but these mosques cater to a specific community. You have a Kurdish mosque, you have a Somali mosque, you have the mosque that serves your Indo-Pakistani community, you have your African-American mosque. You're seeing a trend slowly to make it more diversified, but what these centers, these mosques, actually were, when they were first established, were not only religious institutions, but they were actually community centers, helping people integrate into society, providing English lessons, providing them rides, but also building that community that was so needed for new immigrants. I mean, think about it. You're a refugee. You just left persecution. The last thing you're going to do is kind of venture out to different parts of a state which is very conservative, very different from your hometown, from your home country. So these centers, the mosque actually became these really influential centers that kept the community together, that helped people kind of navigate their way through the systems. And then later on, I think, became more of the religious institutions. And I like to use the example of Salahuddin Center in Nashville, which is predominantly the Kurdish mosque. It was started by the Kurdish community, for the Kurdish community, to help these new refugees come in and really integrate into society. And what they have done now to kind of diversify, they have two services. One is in predominantly Kurdish to help the elders in our community, because the elders still don't know English very well, so they have to cater to their original base. But they're also providing English sermons to really help the youth become more engaged, but also attracting the other non-Kurds into the region. In East and West Tennessee, it's a little more different. The community is a little more diversified. It's smaller than Middle Tennessee, so the mosques have had to cater to everyone. But in Middle Tennessee, you're continuing to see these centers who specifically, for example, the Somali mosque is still a cultural center. And it provides religious services. And I think that's very true for a lot of the mosques in the Southeast, because they have had to play this dual part of being able to preserve their community's cultural identity while also teaching them the religious identity that many are struggling with.
Sure, I think it's also important to talk about how in America mosques serve so many purposes, and they're, as we've heard many times today, commonly referred to as Islamic centers. Sources for education, social activity, community building, and not simply places of prayer. And that is also something that has tremendous historic precedent in Islam. Although in predominantly Muslim areas of the world where civic services are more available in other institutions, mosques have become more focuses of worship. In this country, where folks seek education and social services and community building, which are framed by the tenets of the faith, they turn to that faith community and that community center. This is very much like the early mosques when Islam was in its early days in the age of the Prophet, and it was a minority faith in its region. Mosques offer the same kind of broad community services that we're seeing offered here in America, and of course in Europe as well. That broad-based community service and center.
So we've heard now a little bit about what actually happens in mosques, but we talked about sort of this small but well-organized and well-funded opposition to mosques, and those individuals have been able to gain support. So they're feeding on something, and I wanted to ask Mohamed to talk a little bit about what is it that those opposition movements are tapping into.
It's a very good question. I've actually been sitting here the whole day, so I really saw really high caliber discussions earlier, and I was just like wanting to weigh in, and was holding back because I was waiting to see somebody bring up the issue of the identity crisis amongst conservative Anglo males. So it is really, it requires of us as minorities, faith and ethnically and demographically as Muslims, a lot of comfort in ourselves to be able to sit there and to actually even inquire and want to delve deeper and give them a little bit of breathing space to talk about that. But I see that as actually a very big driver of the creation of the marketplace that essentially these activists that we label at the national level Islamophobes are running to organize in that marketplace. I see that there's what's been interesting for me to watching in Texas is that after 9/11, like I said, the average Texan didn't care about us or anybody else for that matter. They're just go along and get along, libertarian types. But then I see them in talk radio. I did a lot of talk radio in Texas, conservative talk radio. I've done a lot of Tea Party meetings. I've done a lot of, I've been served as an elected official in the Texas Republican Party for over a decade. I've been to a lot of conferences and stuff where I've had these discussions with people, and it's amazed me how many of them have gone into this, like, the victimization. And I'm talking about the conservative Anglo male here, identity crisis. And the way it's metastasizing and reflecting on us as if we're the ones doing something wrong, and they want to force us to kind of conform to their image of what we ought to be doing. And they desperately want us to, been told this many a times, they just want to know that we're all moderates. Well, how do you know that we're all moderates? And, we've been here since 1854, and you can't find one Muslim in Texas that's run around and said, I wanted to impose Sharia on you, right? But you're afraid that now the conspiracy is going to flip into the action phase. And they say, well, you have to come out and basically condemn this group, condemn that group, condemn Sharia. And I'm like, I don't have to condemn anything. And at the end of the day, you're contained. Politically, their movement is very contained. It is not able to develop public policy. And actually,
when you say they, who do you mean the conservative? Okay.
The far right elements that are trying to do this stuff to our community. What I've seen in Texas is that there's the business interests really are the final arbitrators of what happens and what doesn't happen. And by following the role of other faith communities before us, like I mentioned, the Jewish community's state rep Scott Hochberg had told us from Houston, make your friends before you need them on the first legislative day. And he basically, so we followed that. So when the Texas Baptist leadership, when the Catholic bishops, when the mainline Protestant bishops, when those conversations about what does Sharia law mean to us as a community, when the local interfaith relations that these mosques have had with those churches, some going back over 40 years, have been aggregated into a collective, accurate read of what the reality is on the ground, then there isn't the possibility in Texas to overrun our community like what happened in Oklahoma with 70% of the public going to vote a certain way just because some activists out of D.C. Scared them.
Right.
And I think it requires of us a little bit of self-confidence. I think in Texas, I was fortunate that there was such a well-established Muslim community already before I ended up doing any of this stuff. So all I really had to do was just kind of aggregate them and then collectively bargain. Other communities that are much smaller and newer communities like Tennessee have had a much more difficult time because they're trying to put the community together while they're trying to fend off the attacks. It's a lot more difficult.
I want to stick with you for one more minute because you talked a bit about the kind of cultural perception. So this is not the America that we thought we lived in, and these Muslims are going to impose their laws on us. What about the perceived threat of the Muslim community? We talked a little bit about this in terms of, they're going to build a mosque and store their weapons in my backyard, and just knowing your work in terms of the intersection with the Muslim community and some of the sort of security apparatus. We talked a little bit about, I think Muhammad Yunus earlier talked a bit about sort of the evidence in terms of polling of Muslim Americans who are involved in their local mosque are more politically engaged, more civically active, all of the sort of indicators of integration into society. But what about from a security perspective? Is there anything to indicate that there's a real security threat?
Well, that's an open-ended question. Just in case some people are watching, let me go ahead and say, yes, there is security threats out there. The challenge is not recognizing that there is security threats. It's calibrating your response properly to that threat. Which that's where research would come in, so you can have some empirical data. That's where a lot of case studies get batted around to basically compete against other case studies. And when it comes to the security issue concerning mosques, my experience has been there's two areas. One is intelligence-related security matters, and the other one I would call political security discourse. So this is where people, and really here, the way I kind of read the central core fear is that Muslims are somehow resilient to change or adaptation or values of foreign. I think some earlier panels talked about the experience of the Catholics and the Know Nothing movement earlier. In this fear, I really, give you one example of how we kind of dealt with that issue. We looked at the Christian community in Texas, or the faith community. The Jewish community is very progressive. So they come on board fairly quickly. They've been there in the South for a couple hundred years. They've seen different cycles. They respond to protecting minorities fairly quickly. Amongst the Christian communities, the mainline Protestants, also very sympathetic, don't have to do much. Catholics, relations with Muslims and Catholics have been going on for decades at all levels up to the Pope. And then we basically saw that we're never going to get like the Pentecostals and those small denominations on the far right. But the bulk is going to be the Baptists. And then we're going to have to divide and see there's fundamentalist Baptists, like the Southern Baptist Convention, and then there's mainstream Baptists and those networks. And we're like, okay, we're not going to be able to bring these people along because they're politicized. I mean, honestly, that's how I just see them. But and their creed, essentially the 2000 Faith and Order Statement, if you read it, you can walk away thinking that Muslims do believe in a different God. So when they do say that, it's reality. I'm not going to convince them otherwise. But the mainstream Baptists, those people, I basically sat with them, and I was like, okay, so explain to me the Baptist narrative in the Baptist history. They are very pro-religious freedom. They've got like a 400-year history of their evolution on the topic. So I went and I was like, okay, so what segment of the Muslim community would they have the biggest problem with as a security issue and all this? And they said, the Salafis. Essentially, it's the Salafis. So I was like, okay, so I go talk with the Salafis. And the largest Salafi conference in America was happening in Houston every year, the first half of the last decade. So, I mean, when I first went to that conference, they had religious police from the community to keep men and women off the same escalators and elevators. And it was just like an importation of a totally different environment than what I grew up in. And then I was like, okay, so I have these discussions with their leadership. And within 6 months or so, you can actually take a very conservative theological Muslim who doesn't want the politicization of his religion, not by manipulation or by governments like Saudi Arabia or anybody else, and doesn't want the liberalization that liberal Muslims will advance. And you can get them to say, okay, well, look, it's the argument that the Baptists would say that the non-establishment clause actually is to protect religion. It's not to contain religion. You can get them to that same thought using, of course, their own version of usul al-fiqh. And then I basically took the head of the Baptist Christian Life Commission, had her and Gene Polinsky from the First Amendment Center in Nashville flew down, and they spoke at that Salafi conference the following year in the opening session. So you have all these people that have never seen a non-Muslim come to their conference. All of a sudden they're having somebody from a 5,000-plus congregation, Baptist congregation network, and a woman at that, sit there and tell them about their history, and then their chief clerics say, you know what? We agree. In America, there should be the mainstream understanding of the Establishment Clause. Now, that took care of all the cultural issues, because every time in Texas somebody would mobilize and say that there's a security issue of these people are going to change my constitution, the Baptists had a real-life experience to ally with the Catholics, the mainline Protestants, the Jews, and everybody else, and the movers and shakers in the power structure would be able to present that reality. I haven't had to do anything else on that. The other part of the intelligence security part, the mosques, there were mosques where mosques are a problem if you have basically a small cabal of people that are doing one thing in public in front of the community and then under the table doing something else, or behind closed doors doing something else, whether that's recruiting youth to send them overseas in militant conflicts or funneling money to terrorist groups overseas. That's where the concern of law enforcement is, so material support and domestic radicalization. The more you can make that mosque transparent in its governance process, its finances, and you feed it into a regional shura body or multi-congregational democratic structure in the Muslim community like we did in North Texas, where they vote on everything. And then you show the FBI and you show the other law enforcement agencies that transparency, and then the law enforcement agencies will slowly come out of their trenches and test. Mm-hmm. And when they see that the Muslim community leaders in those congregations that they try to partner with in order to advance the security of the whole society, then, and it ends up positively, then you now have two people that worked on a joint project and are forever buddies. You know, on a personal level. It's not an institution thing of FBI and Mosque X.
Right.
It is two people that have worked in the trenches together. And you slowly build that day after day, and you start with very easy partnership efforts all the way up to eventually some of the international radicalization cases that I've worked.
So, Remziya, I want to turn to you now because I think what Mohamed described in terms of the history and the sort of work of the Muslim community with other faith communities in Texas is a pretty long history, and I know the work that you've been doing is somewhat shorter in terms of history, but somewhat effective as well. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'll start with Murfreesboro Mosque, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we did around the anti-Sharia movement that plagued our state last year. In Murfreesboro, the historical background of Murfreesboro is it was very helpful for us in getting support for the Murfreesboro Mosque. In the 1920s, when the first Catholic Church was established in Murfreesboro, we had the KKK actually march in the street against the Catholic Church. Later on, when the first Hindu temple was built and then the Buddhist temples were built, we had the same opposition come out. Maybe it wasn't as intense as what the Catholics saw, but we saw the opposition. And then now, with the Murfreesboro Mosque being established there, we saw the same thing, the protests, the marches in the community against the construction of the mosque. So the first individuals, the groups, really to come and support the mosque were the Catholics, the Buddhists, and the Hindus in the region who said, we share history with you all. We know exactly what you are going through, and we will help you, and we will protect you. And that's really how the community has been so successful. It's because those individuals with the shared experience have come in and said, let us help guide you in this process. The community in Murfreesboro for a very long time was very afraid to even come out publicly, say anything, because they would say, we have enough attention as it is. We don't want to bring any more attention to us. We don't want to make any comments. But it was really the interfaith community who stood up and said, no, enough is enough. We're not going to repeat history. We're going to allow the community to establish. Yes, we've had our challenges. We've had our difficulties. The biggest opposition to the mosque right now is actually a church. It's one of the biggest mega churches in the region out there. And the pastor is adamant about not helping the mosque establish. But what you're seeing also is that the majority of people in Murfreesboro and the majority of people in Tennessee, in a recent poll showed that they support religious freedom and they support, most importantly, the community in Murfreesboro for establishing. And when we had the incident against the opposition of the Murfreesboro Mosque starting up, we got a lot of interfaith support. Community was really starting to mobilize itself, the Muslim community, because we had a series of vandalisms and also hate crimes happening across the state. Our community was really fragmented at the time. Everyone was doing their own things. Each mosque was doing its own thing. And when these hate crimes and vandalisms occurred, it was a wake-up call for us. It was the moment, it was this opportunity for us to unify as the Muslim community in Tennessee. The community generally was not a unified voice at all, and did their own thing. And then when we had the vandalisms, the Murfreesboro Mosque, we started putting our support together, helping the community out there. And then finally, the biggest, I kind of say the blow at the time for us was the anti-Sharia bill. The anti-Sharia bill was being pushed by a few lawmakers. It was being pushed by the folks in Murfreesboro who were leading the opposition. They were able to get the national groups to support them to bring the bill to the state level. So when the anti-Sharia bill made its way, we had interfaith groups who were helping us in Murfreesboro. We had interfaith groups who were speaking up with us at press conferences, at the cleaning up of vandalisms. So come together once again and say, okay, this is another issue. It's no longer about Muslims in Tennessee. It's no longer about Islam. This is truly about religious freedom, preserving religious equality in Tennessee. So the community there, the Muslim community, for the first time we had one of the most historic mobilizations in our state. But that was not only because of us, but it's because of the years of work that we had done to build the relationships with the interfaith community. And those interfaith communities continue to be the key allies for us to help kind of move the political process. And that's kind of my role came in. Coming into this work, I was doing immigrant and refugee works, and then last year, all of a sudden, I was forced to explain what Sharia was. I never knew the concept of Sharia, and I'm not making this up. It's not something that as a Muslim you grow up with. You say, oh, I'm going to go and practice Sharia today. I remember picking up the phone, and I'm calling my imams from across the state, and I'm like, guys, what is Sharia? Explain it to me. I got to go talk to politicians, because my work was as a at the moment as a policy coordinator for a local nonprofit, and so I was the only Muslim face at the Capitol. And so going back and learning what Sharia was and then having to explain that was a really interesting moment for me in my life, but it also helped me be able to interact with our interfaith leaders who I could sit down with now and say, okay, this is what Sharia is. You probably know more than me. But then we as a group and a collective group, we actually went to the Capitol with a series of meetings, not only through mobilization, but behind-the-door meetings with high-level officials in our state. And we're able to really take away the anti-Sharia bill completely and get support of individuals we never thought would support us. My favorite example is this. The group that your most least likely ally was the Tea Party. The East Tennessee, we have one of the most strongest Tea Party groups. We would never work with them in years. I mean, we were completely different, I would say, realms of the political sphere. But the Tea Party actually released a statement against the anti-Sharia bill because it was too much government intervention. So that was really for us to think a little outside the box, forcing us to bridge new interfaith allies, but also think of those unlikely allies that were so helpful in helping us really beat the anti-Sharia movement. But now what we're seeing now is really our communities just had enough of this anti-Muslim Islamophobic rhetoric in Tennessee. People are ready to move on. They're wanting the community just to build their mosque and this whole mess to be over with.
Can I respond to a couple of things quickly?
I
wanted to talk about three things that have been touched upon. And first is the question of fear and perception of fear and danger. The best way that I have seen fear countered is experience. And it's been amazing to go back and look at communities that have survived, have come through mosque development controversies, and seen neighborhoods really and truly broken by the process. And folks who are in the strongest opposition, oh, my kid's going to get shot playing baseball in the backyard because my backyard goes up against the mosque's property. I mean, going back and talking to those people and hearing folks say in very humble ways, I couldn't have been more wrong. Mm-hmm. I just had no idea. None of the things that I thought would happen in this building have happened. But that's not something that you can really teach someone. People have to see Muslim communities functioning in neighborhoods and understand the contribution that they can make, which is not unlike the contribution that any other faith community makes. And I think that over time, and it's hard to hear someone say now, wait it out, but I think that over time, as more mosques are established and function in communities, we're going to be more comfortable with the idea and understand that they will contribute in the same way that other faith communities do. The question of, I wanted to return to the idea of democracy and consensus. I think of local Muslim communities as sort of quintessentially American organizations because of the decision-making process and the representative structures for governance that happen inside mosques. Now, depending on the faith community, the governing boards of faith communities might be representative of everyone in the mosque. That is, they may have young people, they may have women, they may not. It may be a bunch of old guys, but it is still a form of representative governance and decision making, and there couldn't be anything more American than a process of representative leadership. And that structure, I think, makes mosques very well suited to, when faith communities organize in this country, you must engage with civic structure and government structure for financial reasons. You establish yourselves as 501c3 not-for-profits to get the tax benefit of the charitable tax benefit, so that when folks give money to your institution, they get a tax break for their gift, right? And that you don't pay property taxes. That structure, that civic structure, requires the same kind of representative board structure that already exists in a Muslim faith community. So there's no reason that mosques would be incompatible with democratic process and decision making, because it already exists as part of the institution. The other thing that I'd like to say about interfaith coalitions and their importance is that they provide cover. they make a safe environment in which other people can stand up and stand in support of Muslim communities. It's less scary as the lone neighbor or one of a few neighbors in a community who are willing to stand up and say, I'm okay with these guys being here. It's safer to do that when you're standing up with a room full of ministers and their faith communities standing behind them. And it's true that you never know where your allies are going to come from. So it's important to think beyond the rabbis and the ministers to other civic organizations, good government organizations that might be willing to stand with the faith community.
Okay, great. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of things on the law enforcement related part. So there's, I see it as like a triangle. My family originally is from Egypt, so everything has to be a pyramid. Every diagram. So you have like the three corners are intelligence, law enforcement, and community. So if you can basically, as a community, in that community corner, you've shown the transparency and the democratization and the ability that all the segments of the community are functioning just like ideally we'd want the full society to function, participating in the process. And then you also show that the messaging coming out of the community is it's authentic to not just the values but the political viewpoints in that community. So I'm not saying that the local imam, for example, should stay away from ever talking about foreign conflict zones or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But you should understand how other segments of the society hears what he says. So when that takes, there's a responsibility on like our generation to sit down with them and be able to translate for them and say, look, you can say this is what you're really trying to say. If you say it this way, it'll be understood properly. You say it this way, this is what people are hearing. That's helpful. And so you basically get the community to feel like it is not having to get muzzled or it's losing its ability to express itself. I remember in the Virginia 5 case, afterwards there was a lot of push to, well, maybe the Muslim community is not talking about radicalization issues. And then I was like, I gave an interview to the BBC, and I was like, look, we should, and law enforcement specifically, should allow the Muslim community to discuss anything and everything above ground. You want these issues discussed above ground. That means that the other, if law enforcement understands that and understands where the reality is of the equilibrium point in the community and how decisions are made, then when they hear that kind of rhetoric in a community, they understand that it's beneficial. It's a First Amendment activity. It is not the material support to terrorism activity. And then the law enforcement calibrates its responses properly because it has those trust relationships in the community that it's able to essentially know what the real deal is. And then the third corner with intelligence. There is always intelligence coming in about concerns, not just in the Muslim community, but in every single segment of our society. That is just the nature of how intelligence works. But intelligence, you will always have security practitioners or so-called security experts on TV that will, they get a little piece of information. It's largely, sometimes it's even associational, and they'll extrapolate from it something really big. But those that really, really understand the field of intelligence or sit in classified regular threat briefings on the global threats our country faces, like I do, you know that, it's like looking through a straw. You'll see something. You'll see a dot. A lot of people will say, well, connect the dots. Well, I just looked through the straw a few times, and now I've got this drawing. But if I step really, really far back, I see that what I thought I saw is actually a much bigger picture. It might be an elephant instead of a little smaller thing. That real intelligence people, experts, are always very calculated in their statements. They're always very, they have wisdom. And what we had to do was find some of those people from inside the system and have them and their perspective be relayed to the mainstream media in our area. Because those are the people that have credibility. And if they're able to relay the real state of affairs in the community from the intelligence concerns, then these guys that are running around the country, like you see in Fear Inc. and other places, that are like, hey, I'm an ex-CIA or I'm ex-FBI or I'm whatever. I'm not really in a position of authority on any issue, and I'm not really getting briefed on anything, but let me tell you what I think is happening right now. Those people, they can continue to play the tactical game that they're playing of scaring the people that don't know any better, but they can never really achieve anything on the strategic level. No police chief is going to follow them or sheriff and allocate direct law enforcement resources to go snoop on his mosque in the local area or allocate those resources because the FBI in his area is going to be telling them, listen.
Except New York and New Jersey, for example.
I have always said, like in my congressional testimony 2 years ago, I said New York PD and LAPD are exceptions. Told Jane Harmon that in the testimony. I said, you can't extrapolate from those two and say local law enforcement is doing this. Those two agencies are very unique in their budget capabilities, and I'm speaking as one that knows a lot about both of them and their activities. New York PD, they are an agency that has more resources than just about anybody else. They're 4 times the size of the FBI. They're able to allocate a whole lot of resources, and they're basically trying to go for total information awareness. They want to know everything because they don't want to miss anything.
Well, that's why it's so terrifying, right? Because they're getting their direct feed from Zuhdi Jasser. I mean,
well, no, they're not.
I mean, but the training documents are.
If you want to deal with NYPD, the real decision maker in NYPD is the commissioner. And the political cover is coming from that city council, and that's a proper political oversight, and they need to decide to change it. The rest of the government is not going to really do anything. Zuhdi Jasser and anybody else like him are really opportunists. They provide political cover for people with real political power that are doing things. And I'm speaking on the NYPD when this administration decided to come up with its countering violent extremism strategy and approach. They held a meeting February 3rd in New York City, 2010. I was brought in as a subject matter expert, the case studies that I've worked in the field, just like other law enforcement officials. And sat on a panel with the Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD for Intelligence. They presented their model. I presented my recommendation for the community-based partnership approach that we've got working. I've sat in closed-door intelligence meetings with law enforcement officials on panels with the operational head of NYPD on the psychology and sociology of terrorism subjects. I've dealt with those people in real cases, in the community, some with the Bureau, and then some even after they're arrested in jail. And so I gave my read on that system. The NYPD has, in my opinion, some extra alarmist perspectives on things. I think they grew their haystack in the hopes of finding the needles. But that is not, and you can't extrapolate what happens at NYPD and say local law enforcement are doing that across the country.
I want to start opening it up to some questions because I think there's a lot we could cover, and I want to hear from the audience as to where they want to go with the conversation. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. I want to be sure we get some questions from the audience. So there's 2 microphones. I ask that you tell us who you are and please keep it to a question. Thank you.
Paul Ramshaw, EEOC. Or do I have a different perspective from Mohamed on what the FBI and security and privacy and civil rights is all about? But mic's off. Hello? Okay. I'm
I'm sorry, I forgot my question. Oh. Masjid governance. You're saying does an average masjid have a board? How does the board get selected? If people aren't members, how do you view it as a democratic polity?
It varies community to community, and perhaps some other Muslims at the table can answer the question as well. But there's generally a governing body that's sometimes called the Majlis Ashura, sometimes the board of directors. Depends community to community. Sometimes they're appointed, sometimes they're elected, sometimes they're appointed. There's a wide variation. Do you want to address from your experience?
Yeah, there's in my region in Texas, there are my dad's mosque. They're so democratic that they've got two board of directors, a board of director and a board of trustees, and they spend a lot of time trying to figure out who has the final say on matters all the time. And they're all elected from the congregation. And there are other mosques that are on the 180-degree spectrum where it's essentially the imam has kind of a pseudo board in front of him. But he's really the authority in that community. He controlled the appointment of these people, and he's running his little. He's king of that molehill.
But in the case where they're elected,
majority,
you said by the congregation, does that? I mean, if there is no actual membership, can anyone who happens to be attending that Friday prayer vote in the?
They're generally, if they're elected from the congregation, then there is a membership sign-up process in that congregation.
Okay.
And that's honestly where the majority of them are in my region.
Would you say that's?
Yeah, I mean, for us in Tennessee, it's a mixture. I mean, some of them, whoever donates gets to vote on who they want for their board. Other masjids are so small that what they've done is have elders in the community who have been here the longest, who know the process, have been the board members until the next generation is ready to take over. And then some parts, it's a shura that's done based on whether it's through electing them or just kind of identifying them. But I haven't seen in Tennessee where Mohamed just talked about where the imam controls the board. I would say in Tennessee, most of the times the imam is actually not allowed on the board. He's allowed to attend these meetings. He's allowed to be a part of these discussions, but ultimately the board decides. And the imam is just really in the community doing community outreach work.
We should also point out that not every Muslim faith community has an imam. There is a shortage of trained imams in this country. There is beginning to be, there are some training programs and accreditation programs for imams being developed at the Hartford Seminary, for example. But some communities, there is an elder in the community will lead prayer, which is really the core job of an imam is to lead prayer, and then that board makes decisions in the place of an imam, and they'll bring in guest speakers for a sermon on Friday. So there is a real, depending on the size of the community, the resources of the community. Some communities can't afford to pay an imam full time. There is no single model.
My dad used to be at a small mosque. It's another mosque he helped build. He's a geophysicist, and he was a volunteer imam there for 15 years. So that's a perfect example. We see that even in big city communities. You'll see these satellite little congregations that develop, and it's part of their embryonic growth phase. But I wanted, if you'll allow me just 15 seconds, to say that I don't want to be misunderstood. I did not endorse any security agency 100%. But I also recognize that in the national discourse on Muslim community and law enforcement relations, it is also not accurate of what the reality is across the whole country. I spoke about my region. I spoke about what I saw and what's happening there. There are other communities that have tensions with the Bureau or other agencies. I have laid out to community leaders across the country in all the national organizations the roadmaps we took to help fix our reality in our area. Other communities are following or doing it in their own model, like Tennessee. It's up to each Muslim community to do their own thing. There isn't one single reality that's nationwide.
Tim, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do, actually. Tim Rivera, I'm with the British Council. this could be for any of the panelists. I'm curious, one thing that briefly came up, I think, during the second panel was around interfaith work, using mosques with synagogues, churches, working on other community issues beyond interfaith and security-related issues. How do you envision, Mohamed and Remziya, you can speak perhaps to what you might be doing in your own regions that are interfaith work in the sense of multiple communities, faith communities coming together to work on joint community issues that are non-faith or non-security based.
Right.
But what can that do to actually improve either the security situation or sort of the greater understanding and build trust between people of different faiths? I'm just curious about trying to shift the shifting perspectives away from sort of strictly faith-based and security-based things towards something socioeconomic or something else.
And I think you touched on this a little bit when you talked about the child health care bill that you guys worked on. So I don't know, Remziya, you want to go first and then?
Yeah, I mean, in Tennessee, I think we've done it around numerous things, a lot of political issues, because that's the one area that we're getting targeted, specifically around issues for immigrants and refugees, whether it's English-only initiatives or issues around health care access and things of that nature. So we do work a lot with them. But the one other thing we've done, we've created many what we call Circle of Friends or Family of Abraham, which are religiously centered, but they do other activities, whether it's bringing in guest speakers to talk about issues happening, international issues, or it's issues happening in our community that we want to have a discussion on that we don't know much about. So we partner with, whether it's the Jewish or the other broader Christian community, Catholic community, in that sense, and it just depends on what's happening at the moment for us in Tennessee, but definitely it's constantly we are doing these interfaith groups that are brought together based on religion, but we take on other issues.
I think this is, I don't know where the speaker went. This is really the way forward, I think, to move beyond conflict response all the time, because I think that with all the good that interfaith initiatives do, I think they talk to themselves a lot. And you're speaking to a room full of people who are already on board with why can't we all just get along? And that focus needs to be turned outward. And one of the things that I think can be important about partnered outreach and charitable work is finding another way to make Muslim faith communities feel safe. If there's a soup kitchen, I'm just making this up, but there's a health clinic at a mosque, some folks may feel uncomfortable going to a health clinic at a mosque. If it's a health clinic co-sponsored by multiple, an interfaith coalition, that might feel safer. And it completely changes the conversation from them and what's happening in there to what we all get in there. And I don't know if you'd host Alcoholics Anonymous at a mosque, but there doesn't seem to be any fear about entering a Presbyterian church for that kind of meeting.
I think what we'll do is maybe take these three questions all at once and then let you guys respond, and then we'll close up here. So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Hassan Saeed. I'm from the City College of New York. And also I'm a blogger at a group blog called Muslimanity. And so for going back to particularly the NYPD issue, I think that really hits home because my campus was especially targeted, and it's the Muslim group on campus was followed all the way up to northern New York, where they went on a whitewater rafting trip. And I personally helped us set up a rally to speak out against the NYPD spying on the students on our campus. And the reason why for me it was very scary was because the NYPD wasn't only spying but literally mapping out the Muslim community, going from the shops to the places where the men hang out and finding where the people buy halal meat and things like that, and really it sort of reminded me of Kristallnacht, the Night of Long Swords, sort of finding out where all the Muslims are, so if anything you can go after them. So my question to probably Mohamed would be is that how do you respond to this? Because this really alienates the community, because in a lot of the cases the NYPD was spying on the very mosques that their community outreach coordinators were working with. So what sort of a message does that really send to the community that is responsible for 40% of the terrorist cases that were uncovered, which are uncovered by Muslims? So how should the community respond to a vast security apparatus such as the NYPD? Really, in my case, overreaching. So, thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Hello, I want to thank the panelists for a great job. My name is Omniya Al-Hakim. I am professor and director. My question is relating to women in Islam and women in... Sorry.
Good catch.
Not bad. The welcoming environment in mosques. It's really not welcoming at all for women. And then when we think about any organization that has talk about Sharia or talk about fikr and understanding or Majlis Shura, you don't see women contributing or feeling comfortable to contribute, and they are not encouraged to contribute. And I know that Islam is great about encouraging women and giving rights and all that, but we see that actually whoever controlling or ruling trying to exclude female from being an effective and efficient part of every mosque, or if any or most of the meetings that should be inclusive and should be having the 50% of the society.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi, my name is Noah Westroik. I'm a student at McAllister College in Minnesota, and I'm interning here for the summer at the Interfaith Alliance. My question kind of ties in nicely with the previous question. It's about children. It hasn't come up at all today, and it's something that I'm just thinking a lot about. At least when I follow the news in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, there's lots of claims that terror is being taught in the mosque, and terror is being taught, hatred of the Jews is being taught to children in the mosque. And I know this is a misperception. And I'm wondering how the mosques in America handle their youth, and what this generation that's going to be, the next generation of leaders growing up in a multicultural community where Islam is certainly more accepted. It will be more accepted than it is now, and I'm wondering what the representation of that is. Thank you.
I might start by actually responding a little bit to the last question and then turning it over to all of you as well. So I think one of the interesting things that was found in the study that I mentioned earlier, that was the 2011 study on mosques, is that similar to many religious communities, the Muslim community has a challenge with engaging young people in our mosque structures. Now, some of that may be related to some of the gender tensions that one of the other questions came up with. But I think this is a challenge for faith communities across the board. I mean, I could ask our colleagues at Interfaith Alliance about this, but I think that this is something that is a challenge in terms across the board. How do we engage youth? I think it's particularly hard for the Muslim community because of the lack of resources to engage people like youth coordinators. I think it's something like only 30% of mosques have a full-time imam, and that's usually the only staff person. So to think about somebody who can engage programs with youth, I think this is a big challenge for our community, and is something that as we continue to grow and hopefully dedicate resources and realize the value of these types of programs is something that can be addressed. I think one of the other things that I'll just comment on quickly before I turn it over to you all. So ISPU actually did a study looking at khutbahs, so the Friday sermons that are preached, because there was a lot of discussion about what is preached and what kind of extremism is being indoctrinated in mosques. And I don't know, surprising or not, most of, I think the finding was like 80%, 90% of the khutbahs exclusively focused on sort of faith-related, what does our faith tell us? How do we practice our faith? Those types of things. It was, for those of us who hope that mosques can be more encouraging of political activism, it was very apolitical. Hardly any khutbahs looked at issues of foreign policy, looked at issues of even what was happening in the world and the local community. They were very apolitical, very sort of concentrated on the practice of the faith. So So that, I think, is an interesting response to those who would say, well, they're inciting political violence, or they're sort of focusing on sort of foreign wars and, encouraging people for those of us who wish that the mosque would get people actually more engaged in local life, that's a bit disappointing. So I'll turn it, I guess, over. I just wanted to give those brief responses.
Well, maybe one more piece on that study. What was very interesting about it is that the reason that this researcher found that the sermons were apolitical was less about, you would think perhaps you'd think in a post 9/11 environment that this would be about fear of being misunderstood, right, or fear of seeming too political because you don't know who's listening. And that's not what he found at all. What he found is that there was a real concentration on educating the faith community because the Muslim American faith community is demographically young, and is living in a non-Muslim society, and needing to support following the path in Islam in a place that can be very challenging. Whereas a minority, it can be challenging to follow that path. Supporting that process, supporting people in their faith lives, was the motivation for that focus in the sermon, and not fear and not perception.
So I think the other remaining questions are on the women's space for women in the mosque and the surveillance, how to respond to surveillance.
So I wanted to say that I'm the father of 3 daughters. So I will obviously have a personal interest in wanting to see women more involved in the decision making. There's a lot. I've seen females in our community get really excited about this issue and burn themselves out, butting heads with immovable objects. And I've seen people working for the long-term change, slowly using soft power to realign some of the key donors, so the philanthropists in the local communities that stand behind the mosques and Islamic schools and what have you. And I've seen some that have developed special skill sets, like, say, if they're very good at handling media relations, then that mosque board, even if it's a closed little circle of guys, is going to need that skill set when they find themselves in a crisis communication situation. So each situation is really dependent on that local environment, but what I've seen most often work is the ones that approach change slowly, not the shock therapy method of let's crash the prayer hall. It was tried in Austin many years ago. It didn't work too well. It created a countercultural backlash that lasted several board elections, and it ends up not helping to move the community forward. Concerning the NYPD, again, so basically where our community concern is that you have a situation where a kid becomes quote-unquote radicalized, is flirting with bad ideas, deviance in any which way. Either the community knows about them through family members or community elders or clerics or what have you, or law enforcement gets a tip about them. This is the point when that happens. At this point is when the criminal justice system takes over, where they can be prosecuted for actually breaking a specific law, like actually planning for a terrorist attack or trying to get components to put together a bomb or something like that. There's an action here. The law does not directly punish you for just having ideas, but expressing the ideas can be used by the prosecution to show intent. So that's when they see intent, that's where the sting operations of the Bureau can come in and say, they can pretend to be Al-Qaeda and provide the resources after the intent has been shown by the subject. Where our community interest is that we don't want to see misguided youth that are led into a life of prison. And we also don't want the negative PR to the community. So what we want is between this point and that point an off-ramp. When the issue of gang violence began in American policing decades ago, American police, local police like Chicago and LAPD, tried to solve the problem by themselves using hard power. They would try to break up these gangs and arrest them. They basically would go proactive into this in-between space and crack down. It did not work too well in the African American community. It ended up producing a lot of backlash. Several decades later, in South Central Los Angeles and other places, they started teaming up with LAPD, for example, with African American pastors. So if they see a kid creeping towards joining a gang, the pastor can talk to them and basically dissuade them from that route they're on. This is the model that the FBI in my region and other law enforcement once we had enough trust for low-level cases of people who are dissuadable, they've allowed us as a community to handle those situations. In New York City, the NYPD does not currently engage with the Muslim community to allow for such a partnership relationship where it's operationalized, where the community actually helps in community policing and protects its own and guides its own. Instead, the NYPD is essentially trying to take care of this whole gray zone by itself proactively. Last January, in one of those classified threat briefings, because the Deputy Commissioner for Counterterrorism for NYPD was sitting next to me at a DHS briefing, and I asked him, I told him, I think if you guys basically would put forward such a model, if you would engage the community, if you're interested, I'd be more than willing to help. Because, of course, we don't want to see the tension between the Muslim community and the fear that I hear from MSAs and other places with local police. They're just, they haven't made that executive decision. The political leadership in the New York City have not obviously forced their hand to pursue that. The civil libertarians in our community are challenging in the courts that the surveillance infringe on constitutional rights, and at some point that, as well as another federal action in New York City looking at the previous surveillance, the Honshu decision thing, of whether the NYPD has actually stepped out of its boundaries. But this is the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism strategy that the Obama administration has put together, that DHS has kind of led in this administration to develop. It's the community-based partnership model. This is where ideally, as a country, we want to see this is the most resilient community relationship partnership model that we can have. This is what American policing has learned as best practices over the decades. And I think you have a lot of law enforcement agencies across the country at the local level that are trying to do that. But I'm sorry that you're still struggling in New York City with this. But this is a challenge that your local community obviously has to tweak. And the more law enforcement agencies that you're able to bring on board in New Jersey and other parts of New York State, in the region, and then the NYPD eventually will find that it has to kind of adapt to this market, because the rest of the country is not going to adopt hook, line, and sinker the NYPD approach. There isn't enough resources. We've had tens of thousands of local police officers in the last few years laid off. Budgets are being constrained, not expanded. So the NYPD, I think, strategically cannot win in this marketplace the way it's going. It's going this way because the political leadership in New York City feels like this is the only way that's possible, and it's needed to safeguard the city from another attack. Bring another model to the marketplace, and that's my recommendation.
Okay, Remziya, last thoughts.
Yeah, the issue of children and the youth, I want to briefly touch on that. Yes, radicalization, it is happening in some parts. I mean, there's cases out there. And I think, so we have to admit that. Secondly, I think, for example, in Tennessee, radicalization, thank God, is not an issue for us right now. and it hasn't been an issue. Our bigger issue has been the identity crisis of our youth. Our youth predominantly are immigrant and refugee youth who are not fitting in with their parents' culture and identity, but are not fully being accepted into American society. So what we're facing as Tennessee is not necessarily our youth being radicalized, our youth leaving Islam. That's been a failure for us. Our youth are leaving Islam because they cannot address this identity crisis that they're facing. So what we've done as a community, we've really brought in, in East and West Tennessee, they have youth directors who are doing youth program. But in Middle Tennessee, because of funding and other issues, we don't have youth directors. So we've actually put together a youth leadership program where it's run by current youth leaders who are educating and supporting and mentoring the next generation, helping them address this identity crisis that they're going through, but to help prepare them for the future, to help address the other generation that's coming up. So we are taking steps, and I think that's a model that I'm seeing that's working for us. Every community is going to be different. Every local community is going to be able to address it a little differently than what's happening. Secondly, I want to touch on the issue of women. I get this question all the time. Yes, there are communities where women are not allowed to be a part of the system, not a part about the decision-making process. But I have to say, in my case in Tennessee, that's not the case. Last year when the anti-Sharia stuff came up, I was there, and it was this young female loudmouth going against these elder men, predominantly from across the state. And one of the things that we did butt heads on, they wanted to stop moving forward with our opposition once the anti-Sharia legislation was changed to a material support. They wanted to say, oh, Remziya, it's not about religion anymore. Let's just stop. And I was adamant and said, no way, we're going to continue our opposition. We know the intent. And the response to me was, Remziya, you know what's best. We're going to follow you. So with that, being able to mobilize the community, and currently I haven't seen from any of the imams, from any of the elders, there hasn't been a time when any of the men have told me, Remziya, you can't come do this, you can't say this. No, they have actually been very, very supportive of me and the other few female activists that we have, and have actually encouraged us to speak up at times when no one else would listen. And honestly speaking, knowing most of them Tennessee Muslim women, we're not going to shut up anyways. So they've kind of helped really shape us in becoming the activists that we are. There's not a day that goes by that I don't interact with at least someone from the board of at least one mosque in Tennessee. They're calling me for advice, they're calling me for support, they're calling me for emergency situations to step in. And I'm seeing that happening more now with the other generation that's coming up of the women. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that every community is like mine. But I do want to say that the resilience of the Muslim women is very encouraging. Muslim women have always played a very, very important part in the history of Muslim Americans, and I think we are going to continue to do that. And I'm a living, breathing example of that right now.
I think Mohamed had one last thing, and then we're going to close.
Yeah, I need to make a disclaimer that anything and everything that I said here is obviously just in my own personal capacity. I am the founder of my own LLC. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. It has nothing to do with any of the advisory bodies that I sit on at different levels of the government. So everything that I said, because this is a very politicized sphere, and I tried to be as respectful as I can to every agency out there. But we can have disagreements on how they execute counterterrorism policy. And if one last point that I remembered is Sharia law. When you guys handled the panel, I just remembered that if you check out the congressional record for the 9th anniversary of 9/11, Director Mueller, the FBI, testifying before Congress, was asked specifically by Senator Joe Lieberman in the Senate Homeland Security Committee about the Center for Security Policy, Sharia is a threat to national security arguments and stuff. And on behalf of the FBI officially, they put in the congressional record an official response that It is based on a lot of old intelligence and inaccurate information. It is not a viable security threat. And they even submitted some classified documents to the committee that are referenced, but obviously they're not in the public record that you can view, to prove to the senior policymakers on Capitol Hill that this is astroturf activism here. It is not real intelligence security. It is that political security discourse that I was talking about.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists who have all traveled to Washington to be here with us and gave some really good insights from what's happening on the ground. I just want to thank all of you for being here, and especially you probably noticed that the panels were moderated by each of the partnering organizations, but there are several people who were really integral to this conference that were behind the scenes, so I want to try and name them, and I apologize if I missed anyone, but I want to thank Kara, Tim, and Paul from the British Council, Siwar and Jonathan from ISPU, Ari and Ariel from the Interfaith Alliance, and Ashley from the Freedom Forum here at the Newseum, and all of our interns who were working the front desk and doing various other things. So thank you all again for being here and for participating in this discussion. Thank you.